Welcome back to the Story of God, Part 3. This is going to be our last session for a while. And today we're going to look at the witness of James, the brother of Jesus. In Mark chapter 6, Jesus returns to his hometown Nazareth for the first time after beginning his public ministry. And the people there are kind of perplexed. The residents of Nazareth, they're confused because apparently Jesus was rather unremarkable as a child and adolescent, because now that he's preaching and teaching with authority, they're asking these questions. Is not this carpenter the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. There are a few other places in the New Testament that mention Jesus' brothers, but this is the only passage in all of the New Testament that explicitly names his brothers, indicates that he has 4 brothers, and says anything at all about sisters. And since it's plural, we know that Jesus had at least 2 sisters. This can be a little bit confusing or interesting, surprising maybe, for any Christians who have a Roman Catholic background or influence, because it's commonly believed that Mary remained a perpetual virgin, that after Jesus was born, she didn't have any more children. But this passage explicitly tells us otherwise, that Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. And the primary focus of our conversation today is going to be James, the brother of Jesus. In order to really appreciate who James is, we need to look at him prior to Jesus' resurrection and after Jesus' resurrection. And so that will be our focus today. Jesus begins his public ministry by calling disciples, and crowds of people begin to surround him and listen to his teaching. And we're told that when his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying he has gone out of his mind. Now, we're not told who from his family went to restrain him, but I think that we have some good evidence from the New Testament that it may have been his brothers, perhaps James. Just think about this for a moment. Imagine your sibling, your brother or sister, someone you had grown up with and known all of your life. They decided that they were going to start a religious movement in your community. You'd probably be a little bit concerned as well. And so it's important to look at things from the perspective of James, Jesus' other brothers, and his sisters, and his mother. Because in a culture that operated on honor and shame, that was really the only way to move up in the world. That was the only way to improve your life, was to have honor bestowed upon you. And it was a collective kind of thing. Jesus would not just be bringing shame upon himself if he was mentally unstable or if he made a fool of himself. It would be shame that would be brought upon his entire family. And so presumably, they felt like they needed to take it upon themselves to go and restrain Jesus. And all of this begins to make more sense the more that we learn about Jesus and his brothers. In John chapter 7, we're told, "So Jesus' brother said to him, 'Leave here, go to Judea, so that your disciples also may see the works you're doing. For no one wants to be widely known, acts in secret. If you do these things, show yourself to the world.'" And the reason that we can read this passage with a sarcastic tone is because of verse 5. "For not even his brothers believed in him." That's a pretty definitive statement to make. They tried to restrain him. They did not believe in him, and they even mocked him. So what changed? How did James eventually become a leader of the church if he did not even believe in Jesus? Well, let's look at the next slide. In what is arguably the most important passage in the entire New Testament concerning the resurrection of Jesus, Paul writes to the Corinthians saying, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." Notice how James is kind of named all on his own. Of course, James was not one of Jesus' 12 disciples, so he would not be included among the 12. Sometimes it gets confusing because there are multiple Jameses in the New Testament. Jesus did have a disciple named James, but not his brother. But Paul also, if you notice in verse 7, distinguishes James from the rest of the apostles. So the apostles would include most of the disciples, but it would include other folks like Paul. But Paul decides to distinguish James from all the other apostles as well, letting him stand alone. That's important for us to notice, that it was after James had witnessed the resurrected Christ that his life was changed and transformed. And that's when he became an apostle of the church. So you might be wondering, if James is such an important figure in early Christianity, why do we know so little about him? Especially whenever we find out that there are only 11 references to James in the New Testament, compared to nearly 200 references to Paul and Peter. Well, as I mentioned in a previous session, James and Paul were at odds with each other. They came from different schools of thought. And it seems that because of that, James has been marginalized. But it's important to look at the passages that do speak about James, to consider their significance. So an example would be in Galatians chapter 2, Paul identifies James as one of the 3 pillars of the church: Peter, James, and John. That's pretty significant, especially coming from an opponent, Paul. And even in Acts, when Peter is doing mission work among the Gentiles, and he goes back to tell the elders in the church what has happened in Jerusalem, he's going back to get support for what he's doing. And the leader of the church in Jerusalem was James. Find in Acts chapter 15 that this is one of the most pivotal passages in the entire book of Acts, and it's about the mission to the Gentiles. And it is James who is the one who makes the final verdict. He says, "It seems good to us, and it seems good to the Holy Spirit to allow this to happen." And it's because of James's authority and his leadership that Paul and others continue to take the message of the good news of Jesus into the Gentile world. But if we read the New Testament carefully, we find that James is perhaps in the highest role among the apostles. And he leads the church in Jerusalem. He leads the Palestinian church. So a couple of things we need to know about James is that the church in Palestine was persecuted early on, and James was martyred, which might also account for why we see so little about him in the New Testament. But when we look at the little bit of information that we have about him in Paul's letters and in Acts, we find that James is remarkably close to the teachings of Jesus. In fact, when we compare the letter that James wrote in the New Testament to the Sermon on the Mount, we find multiple parallels, almost as if James had heard Jesus' teaching and he was willing to at least take it to heart and remember it. Maybe God's Spirit had awakened Jesus' teaching in James' heart after he had witnessed the resurrected Christ. But we find lots of parallels between the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of James. The main difference between James and Paul is that Paul is going to the Gentile world, and he wants Gentiles to be able to follow Jesus by faith and faith alone. When we read James's letter in chapter 2, he uses some of the same terminology as Paul. He uses this term justification or justified, and he actually contradicts Paul and says we're not justified by faith alone, but by works as well. And this is where we get this statement that faith without works is dead. And so when we look at James's teaching, we find a lot of emphasis that is placed upon putting our faith into action by doing a lot of the things that Jesus did, by caring for the poor, by caring for those who are disenfranchised, marginalized, and oppressed. Of course, we see a lot of that in the life and the ministry of Jesus. And James seems to have really a special place in his heart for the poor as well. He talks about the poor. He also has some words of animosity towards people who have wealth. And I'm encouraging you in our reading guide this week to read through the epistle written by James. And if we're not careful, we can misunderstand what he's saying here. We can paint everybody with the same brush and essentially conclude that anybody who has wealth is a bad person. In the ancient world, that was almost true. As I said in a previous slide, that the only way that you could advance in the ancient world through this basically caste system was honor and shame. And I guess the other way to do it was to be a really unethical business person. The way to become a rich person in the ancient world, the only way to become wealthy was to oppress the poor and the weak. And so James is pretty outspoken about that in his letter. So we do definitely see some parallels between James and the teaching and ministry of Jesus. Throughout church history, James is remembered as James the Just. And some of the church historians talk about how that his knees were basically deformed because of how much time he spent on his knees in prayer. There are also some other traditions that James had deformities because of some of the persecution that he experienced as the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And we do know that eventually James was martyred. The tradition was that he was thrown off of a high place, maybe it was the roof of a home or a building, and that he wasn't dead. And so then he was stoned to death. And so he, according to church tradition, he experienced quite a painful, excruciating death. But it's important for us when we read the New Testament to remember that there are multiple voices. As Protestants, we tend to go to Paul first and foremost. And it's a little bit troubling, especially when we have 4 Gospels that have the words and teaching and ministry of Jesus. And a lot of times we read Jesus through the lens of Paul, when I try to encourage people to read Paul through the lens of Jesus. Likewise, we need to make sure that we don't allow the voice of Paul to drown out the voice of James. James is an important voice in early Christianity. And just as we use Paul to lead people to Christ and to share the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection, we need to use the letter of James to integrate it into our theology and to make sure that when we talk to people about following Jesus, that it is not just about faith alone, but that faith provokes us to do good works. So I think James would have been a good Wesleyan. I think he and John Wesley would have gotten along, and he would have done well in the Methodist Church because he believed in the importance of both faith and works. It has been a joy for me each and every week to be able to record these video teachings and to be able to share with you and to be in discussion with you each Sunday evening. I pray that it has been a blessing to you. And as we think about the ministry of James, as we look into it a little bit more deeply and as we talk about it, I hope that you are inspired and encouraged to be a witness for Christ. Just as Peter has a unique story of his transformation before and after the resurrection, same thing we can say for Paul. Even the brothers of Jesus experienced this great transformation that took place in their life before and after the resurrection. And that's truly all of our story. We have different personalities, we have different gifts, but God has changed all of our lives before and after the resurrection. I'm looking forward to our discussion about this later this week. Until then, take care and God bless.